My name is Johanna Rivano Eckerdal, and I'm a docent and associate professor in information studies at the Department of Arts and Cultural Sciences at Lund University in Sweden. Thank you for the opportunity to present some thoughts about views on and the shaping of information literacy at this conference. This talk starts by presenting the importance evaluation has for how information literacy is viewed and practiced within educational settings. It moves on to present two understandings of democracy, the liberal and the radical one, with focus on the latter. How these different views implicate different understandings of information literacy is then presented. I argue that information literacy necessarily needs to be connected to understandings of democracy. This is an important and often overlooked issue for understanding if and then how information literacy within educational settings relate to information literacy outside educational settings. I argue that an understanding of these connections is important when designing teaching and learning activities that aim to strengthen information literacy for democratic purposes. I also argue that an agonistic understanding of information literacy is valuable for such endeavors. In 2006, James Elmborg wrote a paper in which he raised a number of important questions related to information literacy. He brings up the issue of evaluation and writes, "The goal of this exercise in definition has been to create a usable definition of literacy, one which looks at literacy in pluralistic, non-judgmental ways. Literacy has long involved value judgments, invested in part in differentiating who is literate from those who are illiterate." I agree with Elmborg in that there are problems whenever literacy, and in other situations, information literacy, are used to judge individuals as either being literate or not. Learning needs to be understood as relational and situated. This complexity is not addressed by those using the sharp delineation brought into attention by Elmborg, that someone either is literate or not. Elmborg also states that judgments often are made within schools in which certain literacies are favored. We can only become aware of the wide range of literacies that are available to people in their lives if we do not favor specific literacies. This understanding is important for both research and practice. What I don't agree with in this quote is the idea that there could be a non-judgmental version of information literacy. I argue that information literacy cannot be comprehended in a non-judgmental manner, and I will explain why. In order to properly understand information literacy, we must recognize that it is an evaluation about how someone acts and performs certain activities. What needs to be understood is that information literacy is a value-laden description, a judgment of practices in a specific situation in which several parties are involved, often with differing goals, but at least one of the parties have learning as one of the goals of the activity. Whenever information literacy is discussed, evaluation is always enacted. This is due to the fact that information literacy has no objective existence. It is not something existing out there, neither in people's minds, nor in the interaction between people in different physical settings. Instead, information literacy relates to practices whenever learning of some kind takes place. Information literacy is always a way to describe certain aspects, enactments of that practice. It is normative, as the description is brought up in relation to a specific set of norms. And someone makes the description, which implies that it must always be made clear who that someone is. Within educational settings, the evaluations that we first and foremost talk about are the descriptions that necessarily includes judgments made by pedagogues, be it teachers or librarians in the case of information literacy. The norms guiding those evaluations are then often the learning outcomes in the curricula. But in settings other than educational ones, it is also important, or perhaps even more so, to state who is doing the evaluation and what norms are guiding it. This description is often missing. Before moving on, I just want to add another important thing. It is that the understanding of the purpose of an interaction is also important for the assessment of it. Since several parties are involved in an interaction, each of them with at least one, but more often various goals, which may be or not be in conflict with each other, it is very difficult, to say the least, to arrive at unambiguous assessments of specific interactions. To conclude, information literacy is always a value-laden description. Both the judge and the basis for making the judgment, including both the norms and the goal for the interaction, must therefore be identified and open to scrutiny. This talk has started by discussing the aspect of evaluation, and will now move on to an exploration of how the evaluation is related to views on democracy. Democracy is defined and practiced in various ways. The significance of information literacy and its democratic dimension vary depending on the understanding of democracy. In the following, the discussion will focus on the liberal and the radical understandings, with emphasis on the latter and more precisely on the theory of agonistics. This is my choice, standing as a feminist, holding a view on democracy and its institutions as important for providing equality for all. I will start by presenting some basic tenets of the theory of agonistics. Chantal Mouffe developed with Ernesto Laclau a theoretical approach to understand social movements not based on class. Mouffe has continued to elaborate her theory, labeling it the theory of agonistics or agonistic pluralism. Antagonism is a key concept in agonistic pluralism, and it's used to denote the central idea that, in Mouffe's words, negativity is constitutive and can never be overcome. The idea of antagonism also reveals the existence of conflicts for which there are no rational solutions. Laclau and Mouffe combined antagonism with the Gramscian notion of hegemony. And Mouffe writes, to speak of hegemony means that every social order is a contingent articulation of power relations that lacks an ultimate rational ground. Society is always the product of a series of practices that attempt to create a certain order in a contingent context. These are the practices that we call hegemonic practices. Things could always be otherwise. The idea of antagonism has a strong impact on Mouffe's formulation of a view on radical democracy. As conflicts will always be part of society, there should be room for conflict within the democratic institutions. She writes, what is important is that conflict does not take the form of an antagonism, struggle between enemies, but the form of an agonism, a struggle between adversaries. An adversary, in Mouffe's theory, is a legitimate enemy. And she writes, the adversarial model has to be seen as constitutive of democracy because it allows democratic politics to transform antagonism into agonism. In other words, it helps us to envisage how the dimension of antagonism can be tamed thanks to the establishment of institutions and practices through which the potential antagonism can be played out in an agonistic way. So, institutions are important. At this point, it is worth noting that Mouffe discusses institutions in two senses. In the first sense, institutions form directly part of a representative democracy, that is, government and the elections of representatives from political parties. In the second sense, institutions within society are understood in a more general sense as indirectly being part of and crucial for the representative system. In this second sense, libraries can be included. Public libraries have in many ways already a prominent role of an institution in which democracy is practiced, a role that can be further enhanced. With this short introduction to some central ideas in the theory of agonistics, I will continue with a presentation of an argument for how the meaning of information literacy changes depending on understanding of democracy. As already mentioned, I will include the liberal and the radical understandings of democracy with focus on the latter. Two ideal types of information literacy are thus developed out of two different understandings of what is democracy and citizenship. In a liberal understanding of democracy and citizenship, citizens have a number of universal obligations and rights to be exercised. Being a citizen in this understanding means meeting obligations one has towards the state, such as paying taxes and participating in elections by casting a vote. As a citizen, you have the responsibility to make good rational choices to ensure that the state is reproduced. Citizens are consumers of the services that the state provides them with to ensure their good life. Within a liberal understanding of democracy and citizenship, information literacy is then viewed as an individual property of citizens. As an information literate citizen, you participate and engage in various activities to fulfill your obligations and to enjoy your rights as a citizen. This view on information literacy means that you keep yourself informed about your obligations as well as aware of your rights as a citizen. It is essential to adhere to the laws and, for example, by mastering information retrieval and evaluation of sources, to be well prepared for the choices to be made in different situations. The state provides citizens with training and education, such as searching for and evaluating information in a proper manner, to prepare them for the commitments they have. Liberal information literacy can therefore be said to constitute the basis for correct behavior, that which follows laws and regulations. Within the radical understanding of democracy and citizenship proposed here, groups and society are viewed as heterogeneous, a community characterized by diversity and difference, or as Chantal Mouffe has suggested, as a pluriverse. In a radical understanding of democracy and citizenship, citizens act for the common good, but are also aware of groups' heterogeneity. A person may belong to several groups with different identities. In any given group, there are consequently different types of imbalance between those who have and those who do not have access to various resources. Information literacy can then, in this understanding, be viewed as enacted in different practices related to information use, in which citizens engage in dialogue with each other and in relation to the information. In dialogues or debates, participants express different understandings of information depending on, among other things, the different identities affected by the information that are drawn upon in the dialogue. Citizens are involved in these practices and interact to manage each situation, which may be conflict-laden, depending on connections to their different identities. Previously, a reference was made to James Ellenborg's paper, Critical Information Literacy, Implications for Institutional Practice. I agree with him on that there is a conflict inherent in information literacy as a critical project, and that it has to do with how democracy is defined. But I argue, contrary to Ellenborg, that most of the time there is no definition of democracy at all. The concept is usually left undefined. Nevertheless, as I have shown, there are different takes on the meaning of democracy, and hence the consequences diverge whenever activities or institutions are referred to as democratic. If left undefined, there is a tendency to implicitly accept the liberal or even neoliberal view of democracy, given the neoliberal hegemony of Western societies today. We now turn to the important question of transfer, and the questions in focus here are: is the information literacy within educational settings related to information literacy outside educational settings? And can information literacy be taught for democratic purposes? If information literacy practices in schools should prepare young people for civic engagement according to a radical understanding of democracy, change is required. Based on my research, I suggest that it would be of importance to invite the use of a broad range of information sources, online and offline, with varying producers and aims, engaging the students in discussions about how to evaluate them. Libraries are spaces where dialogues or debates can unfold about different issues related to everyday life that involve people's different identities, or, put in the vocabulary of agonistics, dialogues that recognizes the radical negativity of our pluralistic society. In such conversations, librarians can promote critical scrutinizing of information sources that goes well beyond evaluation according to standardized lists, but involve how the information is produced, delivered, and consumed. Librarians that engage in their community already exist, inviting and supporting a radical use of their resources. With an agonistic approach, such dialogues could also be spaces attempting to produce counter-hegemonic alternatives. MOVE argues for a counter-hegemonic offensive against neoliberalism and for changing the democratic institutions from within. We are currently witnessing a number of changes in institutions from within, but coming from a very different direction than the ones suggested by MOVE. The result of political elections have led to extreme right populist parties gaining majority or holding the balance of power in a number of countries. Hungary, Poland, Brazil, just to name a few. After the Swedish general election in 2014, the local council in a small Swedish town of Ludvika, one of the representatives of the extreme right party Sverigedemokraterna, also held a leading position within Nordiska motståndsrörelsen, a neo-Nazi movement. This constitutes an example of a deeply anti-democratic worldview held by a representative within a democratic institution. At the end of the 2016 presidential campaign in the United States, the then Republican candidate Donald Trump made announcements that were very ambiguous about whether he would or not accept the election's result. In the present corona pandemic, a number of governments have issued state of emergencies, including curfew and other severe restrictions of people's freedom. The measures to stop a rapid spread of the virus are necessary, but the question has also been raised if this opens an opportunity for opponents of the democratic form of rule to take advantage of the pandemic and dismantle the democratic institutions from within. These are clear examples of how the rules of the democratic institutions are not clearly accepted by some of its representatives. This is in stark contrast to the agonistic view of democracy in which the democratic institutions are highly valued, stressing that a starting point is to recognize the legitimacy of one's adversary. We are therefore faced with a political situation in which people who strongly believe in democracy and its institutions as a way to promote inclusion of all need to make their voices heard. These examples show the need to form counter-hegemonies to defend the dimension of equality within the democratic institutions, an opposition against both the neoliberal hegemony and the strong counter-hegemonies from the extreme right that currently challenge democracy both from within and outside its institutions. Libraries and the work of librarians have a crucial role in offering spaces and interactions important for upholding a democratic society. At times when democracy, understood radically as the constant struggle for equality for as many as possible, is at risk, it is crucial to recognize this role, not least to be able to defend it. Thank you for your attention.